Hey, it's me, Jason PB, and welcome back to another Lightroom CC tutorial. In this project, I'm going to use the Adjustments brush in Lightroom to selectively adjust our image. Now head over to the right-hand side of Lightroom and you'll see the brush tool with the keyboard shortcut B. So select that tool and you're first met with the characteristics of the brush itself. The size, which you can increase and decrease. The feather, which affects the transition of the brush between soft and hard. The flow, which applies the speed at which the brush works on your shot, and the density, which caps or restricts the amount of effect your brush has. So if we have a density of 50 on the slider, that's a 50% restriction. Okay, so I'm going to put that back up and start on our image. So our first set of controls are the temperature and tint sliders, which work in the same way that your white balance does. Now for this shot, the white balance is pretty spot on, so I'm not going to use those, but if you need to adjust your image in any way or you want to make some coloured adjustments to it, you can select that and you'll see that I'm painting an orange overlay here, and actually that's because I have the overlay option selected. So hit the keyboard shortcut the letter O, and we can see the effect of the brush. So as we cool it down and warm it up, that affects the image, but I'm just going to return that to 0. Okay. So the first two sliders that we're going to be adjusting are the exposure and contrast sliders, and you can see there's small dark lines between these sections, which is used to just cordon off these sliders into various areas. So the exposure controls are exposure and contrast. Now we want the puffin to stand out against the background because it's a little bit dark and it was taken on a very grey, very rainy, windy day, and this was the best shot from the day. Unfortunately, the background is slightly brighter than the foreground, and especially the puffin. So in order to brighten that puffin up, I'm going to hit 0 or O and delete the previous brush there, and then I'm going to increase the exposure to +1, and then I'm going to paint over the puffin. So I'm just clicking and dragging over the puffin. You can see him getting brighter as I do that. Now you'll also notice that it's quite dull and faded. The greys are coming in on the bird, the blacks are turning slightly greyer because we're overexposing this area, and the whites are getting brighter, which is what we want, but the whole image is getting a little bit dull. So I'm going to boost that contrast up to about +15, just to bring some of those blacks back in and define the brightness and darkness between the pixels. So the next section is what I use to fine-tune my selection of the exposures. So highlights control the highlights of the shot. You can see that getting brighter and darker. Shadows obviously do the shadow portions, and the whites and the blacks control the white and black areas of your image. Think of this like the histogram when you look on the back of your camera. So I would like the white plumage to be a lot brighter than the background, so I'm going to lift the highlights slightly just to bring that up, not to clip the highlights though. I'm just going to bring that up to about +50. And my shadows seem okay actually. I'm going to leave the shadows where they are, but I am going to bring those whites up just to make that really pop against the backdrop. I'm going to bring them to about +15. And the blacks, again, there are some blacks on here that are a little bit grey, so I'm going to bring that down just to darken it, not too much. I think that looks good, about -20, anywhere between -10 and -20 looks good on this image. So moving on to the next section, we have the clarity, the dehaze and the saturation sliders. Now the dehaze slider would be very good to get some of the background looking a little bit less contrasty, less punchy, so that the puffin stands out even more. So if you head up to the top right of the brush characteristics and click Start New Brushing, this little plus icon, that will give you an entire new brush, which means the brush that you already have on there, you can see that highlighted in red when I hover over that point, will still remain there, and these settings now will alter a brand new brush. So that doesn't alter anything on the puffin. This is a brand new brush, and I can paint over the background, and you can see that's not affecting the image anywhere but where I'm clicking and dragging. I'm just going to Control Z or Command Z on Apple and undo that, and I'm going to zero all of these settings and head down to dehaze. So I'm actually going to turn that down slightly. I'm going to increase the size of my brush, which you can do on the size slider up here, or you can hit the square bracket keys. The left square bracket and the makes it smaller, and the right square bracket makes it larger. And I'm going to paint around the background. Now you can see it being affected, but if you're not quite sure where you're affecting on the image, you can hit the letter 0 and it will display a red or an orange overlay so that you can see exactly where you're painting. So I'm just going to paint everywhere around the puffin. I'm not going to be overly specific with this. I'm just using a large brush with a large feather here. You can see I've got a feather of 71. So I'm going to drop that back in, and that looks like a pretty good selection. I don't want to get anything on the puffin per se, so I'm going to press the letter O again, and you can see that that has desaturated the background slightly, probably a little bit too much actually. I'm going to bring that back up to -5 there. I'm going to do the same with clarity, which adjusts the mid-tone contrast. I'm going to drop that to -10, just very subtly drop that background into a more grayer, less contrasty vibe. But because of that, it all looks rather unsaturated because of the lacking contrast. So I'm going to boost that saturation up to keep the image looking nice and colourful. So I think +70 looks pretty good here. Not too much to clip the colours, but just enough to bring out the greens and yellows and the purples in the image here. So moving on to the next selection of sliders, we have sharpness, noise and moire. Now I'm going to ignore noise and moire for this shot because we don't actually have much of an issue with noise and moire, but if I zoom in and I'm using Command plus or Control plus on a PC, you can see that this image is actually out of focus on the eyes. The focus falls just behind the head here on the wings, and even then it's still a little bit soft, and that's because there was a lot of rain on the day and I had to keep wiping my lens down. So I'm going to make a new brush, going up here to the top right and click Start New Brushing, this plus icon. And although I know I can't save a soft image with sharpening, and that is one thing to bear in mind, no matter how much sharpening you apply, you'll never be able to save a soft image or an image where you've missed the focus point. I am going to turn sharpening all the way up to 100, and I'm going to paint over the head. Not in a bid to make it sharp, because I never will, and you can see there's some of this patterning going on over the plumage here where it looks a bit glassy. So if you hold the Alt button key on your keyboard, you can click and drag and use the eraser, and you can see how it switches on the top right from brush to eraser, and I'm just going to erase a little bit of that in the middle of the head so it looks a bit less obvious. So my idea here is literally just to increase the contrast between pixels. So with sharpness at 100, that's done a little bit, but I'm also going to pop the clarity slider up, and if I zoom back in, you can see that that does add a little bit of mid-tone contrast around the face, so when I zoom out it looks a little bit sharper. And so with that, we have pretty much the finished image. We've increased the brightness of the puffin, we've made the head a little bit sharper, and we've saturated the background but dropped the contrast so that all of the focus is coming from the soft background and foreground and going straight to the puffin.